What if the entire U.S. government was just hours away from shutting down? Millions of federal workers unpaid, critical services frozen, and America's political system pushed to the edge of another massive crisis. But at the very last moment, one signature changed everything. Former President Donald Trump just approved a powerful funding bill that stopped a nationwide shutdown. But here's the real question. Was this a smart political victory or just a temporary escape from a much bigger disaster waiting ahead? Before we break down the shocking details and hidden political impact, make sure you hit that subscribe button, drop a like, and stay with us. Because what you're about to hear could shape America's political future. What if the United States government suddenly stopped working, not because of a disaster, not because of war, but because of politics? That's exactly the dangerous situation America was moving toward before the recent funding bill was signed. And many experts are now calling this moment one of the most critical political turning points in recent weeks. A government shutdown is not just a political disagreement. It is a chain reaction that can affect millions of lives across the country. The shutdown risk begins when Congress fails to approve funding for federal operations. And when that funding stops, the consequences can spread faster than most Americans realize. Without federal funding, government offices across the nation begin shutting down. Federal employees, including law enforcement staff, administrative workers, and public service officials, can suddenly stop receiving their paychecks. Imagine thousands of families depending on those salaries suddenly facing financial uncertainty overnight. But the impact doesn't stop there. Essential services that protect national stability can also face serious disruption. Agencies responsible for national security, border protection, airport safety, public health care programs, and disaster response operations all depend heavily on federal funding. Even a temporary interruption in these systems can create security risks and public fear. Now here's where the political pressure becomes intense. When Americans begin to see government systems slowing down, when workers are sent home, when public programs are delayed, frustration quickly turns into public anger. And in Washington, political leaders understand that a shutdown can damage public trust and shake economic confidence. This is why the signing of the funding bill became such a critical decision. By approving this bill, Donald Trump effectively prevented an immediate government shutdown. Federal agencies were able to continue operating, workers remained employed, and key national programs stayed functional. For millions of Americans who rely on government services daily, this decision helped maintain stability during a moment that could have triggered nationwide disruption. However, while the shutdown was avoided, political analysts are raising deeper questions behind the scenes. Was this decision simply about protecting government operations, or was it also about protecting political influence and leadership credibility? Because historically, government shutdowns often become political blame battles, where leaders risk losing public support. And that's what made this moment even more sensitive. Preventing a shutdown not only protects the economy and public services, but also protects political reputations. Leaders who successfully avoid crises are often viewed as strong decision makers. But critics sometimes argue that temporary solutions may hide larger budget conflicts waiting to explode later. For now, the government continues to operate, federal workers remain on duty, and essential services remain active. But the situation has also exposed how fragile the funding system can become when political negotiations fail. The shutdown may have been stopped, but the deeper budget battle in Washington is far from over. And if future funding agreements fail again, America could find itself standing at the edge of another shutdown crisis. Because in modern politics, stability is often temporary, and the next funding deadline could decide the country's next major political showdown. Behind every major political decision in Washington, there is a battle most Americans never see. And when it comes to passing a government funding bill, that battle can become one of the most intense power struggles inside the U.S. political system. Before this funding package was approved, the United States stood dangerously close to a government shutdown. But what many people don't realize is passing this bill inside the House of Representatives was far from easy. In fact, it was a high-stakes political negotiation filled with pressure, compromise, and strategic decision-making. Inside Congress, Republicans and Democrats often hold very different views about how government money should be spent. Republicans usually push for controlled federal spending, stronger border policies, and reduced government expansion. Meanwhile, Democrats often focus on social programs, public welfare funding, and broader government support initiatives. So when the funding deadline approached, both parties found themselves locked in intense negotiations. Lawmakers knew that failure to pass this bill could trigger a nationwide government shutdown. And that type of shutdown doesn't just affect Washington. It affects millions of Americans across the country. federal employees could lose paychecks, public services could slow down, and economic confidence could weaken almost instantly. This pressure forced political leaders to make difficult decisions. Behind closed doors, lawmakers from both parties worked through complex compromises. Some policy demands were softened, certain funding priorities were adjusted, and several strategic negotiations were made to secure enough votes for approval. But here's the hidden political reality. Compromise inside Congress is never simple. When leaders agree to adjustments, they risk criticism from their own party supporters. Hardline political groups often expect leaders to stand firm on policy positions. So every compromise carries political risk. Despite those challenges, the bill eventually gained enough support inside the House of Representatives. And once it passed, it cleared one of the most dangerous obstacles standing between the government and a shutdown crisis. However, the tension during this process revealed something much deeper about the current political climate in America. The high level of pressure surrounding this vote showed how fragile federal funding negotiations can become. Lawmakers understood that public frustration was rising. Americans were closely watching whether their leaders could prevent another government disruption. Economic experts were also warning that uncertainty surrounding a shutdown could shake financial markets and business confidence. Investors, federal contractors, and public service sectors were all waiting for political stability. So when the House finally passed the funding package, it wasn't just a legislative victory. It was a moment that temporarily restored political balance and economic reassurance. But analysts are now asking an important question. Did this agreement truly solve the deeper funding conflicts between political parties, or did it simply delay a larger financial and political showdown waiting in the future? Because history has shown, government funding negotiations rarely end with one agreement. They often reopen during the next budget cycle, creating another round of political tension and public uncertainty. For now, Congress managed to avoid immediate crisis. But the battle that happened behind closed doors has revealed just how divided and how delicate America's funding system has become. And as Washington moves forward, one thing remains certain. The next funding negotiation could once again test the strength of America's political leadership and the stability of its government operations. When a government funding bill is signed in Washington, most Americans hear the headline. But very few understand what is actually inside that bill. And sometimes, the real story is hidden inside the details. The recently approved funding package is not just about keeping the government open. It is a massive financial blueprint that supports several critical sectors responsible for maintaining America's stability, security, and public welfare. One of the biggest areas included in this funding package is national defense. The United States maintains one of the largest military forces in the world, and defense programs require constant financial support. This funding helps maintain military readiness, supports troop operations, upgrades defense technology, and strengthens national security infrastructure. Without continuous defense funding, military preparedness could weaken, which could create global security concerns. But defense is only one part of the story. The funding bill also supports daily government operations across multiple federal agencies. These agencies manage everything from transportation safety to healthcare administration, financial regulation, environmental protection, and disaster response programs. These operations work quietly behind the scenes, but they form the backbone of public safety and national management. Another major focus inside this funding package is public service initiatives. Programs that support healthcare assistance, education funding, housing programs, and community development rely heavily on federal financial support. Millions of Americans depend on these programs, especially during economic challenges or emergency situations. However, one of the most politically sensitive sections of this funding bill involves border security. Border protection has remained one of the most debated political issues in recent years. Funding in this area can support border enforcement, surveillance systems, and immigration control operations. For many political leaders, border security represents national protection, while for others, it represents a complex humanitarian and immigration policy challenge. Infrastructure development is another major area included in the funding package. Infrastructure funding supports roads, bridges, transportation systems, energy networks, and public construction projects across the country. These projects not only improve daily life for Americans, but also create jobs and stimulate economic growth. In addition, social welfare programs are also supported through federal funding. These programs help provide food assistance, medical support, and financial aid for low-income families and vulnerable communities. For millions of citizens, these programs serve as essential support systems during financial hardship. But despite the broad scope of this funding bill, experts are raising a serious concern. Many analysts believe this package may only be a short-term financial solution. Instead of solving the long-term federal budget challenge, this bill may simply extend funding temporarily while lawmakers continue negotiating a larger and more permanent budget agreement. And that raises an important question. If this funding package is only temporary, what happens when the next funding deadline approaches? Will Congress reach a full budget agreement? Or will America once again face the risk of a shutdown crisis? Because federal funding decisions don't just affect government agencies. They influence economic growth, national security, public trust, and the overall stability of the country. For now, the funding package is keeping America's federal system operational. But behind the scenes, Washington's budget battle is still unfolding, and the next phase of negotiations could decide the future direction of government spending and national priorities. In Washington politics, every decision is about more than policy. It's about power, public perception, and political survival. And the signing of this government funding bill has quickly turned into a major political moment, not just for Donald Trump, but for both Republicans and Democrats. When Trump approved this funding package, it sent a strong message about leadership and crisis management. Avoiding a government shutdown is often seen as a sign of political control and stability. A shutdown can damage public confidence, disrupt federal operations, and create economic uncertainty. By preventing that crisis, Trump positioned himself as a leader who can keep the government functioning during high-pressure situations. But politics is rarely that simple. While avoiding a shutdown can strengthen a leader's image, it can also create internal challenges. Many of Trump's core supporters often expect strong and aggressive policy positions, especially on issues like border security, federal spending control, and government reform. When political leaders agree to compromises in order to pass funding bills, some supporters may view those compromises as weakening political promises. This creates a delicate balancing act. On one side, Trump needed to prevent a shutdown to maintain public confidence and avoid economic disruption. On the other side, he had to consider how political compromises might affect his support base. In modern American politics, maintaining loyalty among core supporters is often just as important as gaining bipartisan cooperation. Meanwhile, Republicans inside Congress are using this situation to reinforce their narrative of responsible government management. Many Republican lawmakers argue that avoiding a shutdown demonstrates fiscal responsibility and leadership stability. They often present this decision as proof that their party can protect national operations while still negotiating funding priorities. But Democrats are also shaping their own political narrative around this moment. Democratic leaders are highlighting the role of bipartisan negotiation in passing the bill. They argue that cooperation between parties helped protect federal workers, public programs, and economic stability. For Democrats, this moment is an opportunity to promote the idea that government progress requires compromise and cooperation rather than political confrontation. And that is where the political chess game becomes even more complex. Both parties are already looking ahead to future legislative battles and upcoming elections. Every major decision in Washington becomes part of a larger political strategy. Leaders carefully shape public messaging to strengthen voter trust, gain media influence, and build momentum for future policy debates. Political analysts suggest that this funding agreement may not only affect short-term government operations, but could also influence long-term campaign strategies. Voters often remember how leaders respond during crisis situations. Successfully preventing a shutdown can strengthen political credibility, while controversial compromises can create future debate. And this situation has created exactly that kind of political tension. For now, the funding bill has stabilized government operations and reduced immediate public concern. But behind the scenes, political leaders are already preparing for the next round of budget negotiations and policy conflicts. Because in American politics, today's agreement often becomes tomorrow's debate. And the way both parties handle this funding decision could shape the political battlefield for months or even years to come. The government shutdown may have been avoided, but the bigger question still remains. Did this funding bill actually solve America's budget crisis? Or did it simply delay a much larger political storm waiting in the future? Across Washington, many political experts and economic analysts are raising serious concerns. While the newly signed funding package has temporarily stabilized government operations, there is growing belief that this agreement may only serve as a short-term fix rather than a long-term financial solution. Federal budgeting in the United States is one of the most complex political processes in the world. Every year, lawmakers must agree on how trillions of dollars are allocated across defense, healthcare, public services, infrastructure, and national programs. And when political parties fail to reach long-term agreements, Temporary funding bills are often used as emergency solutions to prevent shutdowns. That is exactly what many analysts believe may have happened in this case. Temporary funding agreements buy time, but they rarely eliminate conflict. Instead, they push difficult financial decisions into the future, where negotiations often become even more complicated and politically intense. If Congress fails to finalize a full federal budget agreement in upcoming negotiations, the risk of another government shutdown could return. And historically, repeated shutdown threats can create serious uncertainty across the nation. The impact of that uncertainty reaches far beyond government buildings. The U.S. economy is closely connected to federal stability. When funding disputes create shutdown risks, financial markets often react with caution. Businesses may delay investments. Federal contractors may pause projects. And public confidence in economic stability can weaken. The federal workforce is also directly affected by funding uncertainty. Millions of employees depend on consistent government budgets to maintain their jobs and financial security. Even the threat of missed paychecks can create stress for families and disrupt workforce productivity across multiple sectors. Public services face similar risks. Programs that support healthcare assistance, disaster relief, education funding, transportation safety, and community development rely heavily on stable federal funding. Any disruption in these programs can affect millions of citizens, especially vulnerable communities that depend on government support systems. And that brings us to the political reality behind this funding bill. Future budget negotiations in Washington will now carry enormous pressure. Lawmakers must find a balance between policy priorities, economic responsibility, and political strategy. But as history has shown, reaching long-term agreements is rarely simple. Political divisions between parties continue to shape spending debates, and those divisions could make future negotiations even more challenging. If lawmakers fail to find common ground, America could once again stand dangerously close to another shutdown crisis. For now, the funding bill has provided temporary stability. Government agencies continue to operate, federal workers remain on duty, and public programs remain active. But analysts warn that the real test lies ahead when the next budget deadline arrives. Because in American politics, temporary solutions often create future battles. And the next negotiation in Washington may decide whether this crisis was truly resolved or simply postponed. The shutdown threat may be gone today, but the fight over America's financial future is far from over. And that's the latest update on the U.S. government funding deal. While this move has prevented an immediate shutdown, the bigger question still remains. Is this real stability or just a temporary political pause? The coming weeks will decide how Washington handles the nation's financial future. Stay informed, stay updated, because these decisions don't just impact politics, they impact the economy, federal workers, and millions of Americans across the country. If you found this update helpful and informative, make sure to support the channel by liking this video, subscribing, and turning on notifications so you never miss important breaking news. This is your trusted news update, and we'll see you in the next report.